We read this morning from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." How do we talk about things that are hard to talk about? That covers a lot, of course. Lots of things are hard to talk about, even among people who love each other, especially among people who love each other. Married couples have to talk about money. That's a hard one. Middle-aged people have to talk to elderly parents about end-of-life wishes. Parents have to talk to their teenagers. Just about anything is a hard conversation between parents and teenagers. For those touchy conversations, some people say it helps to talk in the car. On the road, the parties are not face-to-face, but side-by-side facing forward. Some conversations are better with eye contact, and others seem to go better with eyes ahead, all parties looking in the same direction. And maybe that is why about halfway through the Gospel of Mark, Jesus brings up a very hard subject while he's on the road. Not in a car, of course, but still on the road. Jesus has something hard to talk about, and he does it not face to face, but with all eyes ahead. As they walk towards Caesarea Philippi, Jesus begins to teach. And like most good teaching, the lesson begins with a question. Just before the text we read today, Jesus has asked his disciples the famous question, "Who do you say that I am?" Now, if you know the disciples, you know it's always Peter who answers first, to good or bad effect. And indeed, it was Peter this time who blurted, "You are the Messiah." In Mark's version of the story, Jesus tells them not to talk about that. And they haven't even gotten to the hard part of the conversation. Then, that's where today's text begins. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And then Peter takes Jesus aside. Now picture yourself on the road with the disciples. I heard Barbara Brown Taylor say once that she tries to picture a gospel text through the eyes of one of the disciples we never hear from. So picture yourself as, say, Bartholomew. You're watching and you're listening as this scene plays out. You're walking along with Jesus, and he's saying these strange and frightening things. And then as you watch, Peter takes him aside, maybe pulls him off the path entirely, and begins to rebuke him. That's what Mark reports. Now, Matthew's story will give Peter a line or two to clarify, but Mark tells it more through the eyes of Bartholomew or anyone else on the sidelines, someone who really can't hear what Peter's saying, but who can guess from how Peter frowns and flaps his jaw and waves his arms that there's some pretty serious rebuking going on. And then Jesus turns and looks at his disciples and says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, this is kind of a surprising amount of stage direction. Given the sparseness of biblical style, we should assume there's a good reason that Mark takes up narrative space to describe the placement of bodies. So let's do what Mark apparently hopes we'll do and visualize this. Peter pulls Jesus aside, perhaps off the path. After an exchange of some sort, Jesus turns away from Peter toward the disciples, but then he speaks to Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." He doesn't give an order and wait to see if Peter follows it. He's just describing where Peter already is. Peter tried to control the message by taking Jesus aside, but it's Jesus directing the action here. And now, having dealt with Peter's body, he calls everyone's attention to Peter's mind, which is set not on divine things, but on human things. With simple words and actions, Jesus is putting both bodies and minds in their proper place. And as the lesson expands, so does Jesus' control of all the bodies around him. For now he calls the whole crowd toward him along with the disciples. We can imagine he might lean in, his voice low and intense. He will tell them what it means to set one's mind on the divine. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. It's a good thing Jesus is putting everyone in place here, because honestly, things are going topsy-turvy. Grandeur, greatness, glory, human things. Self-denial, self-sacrifice, these are the things of the divine. The divine path leads not to the good life, as Peter might have imagined, not to riches or military triumph or political power. The divine path leads through the hardest places: suffering, loss, grief, and death. All the places that humans would like to avoid. Indeed, we might typically measure a successful life by the lack of suffering it involves. Do we even measure our faith that way? Pastor Mike Ashcraft, in his book, My One Word, notes that people sometimes measure their faith in God by how well their life is going. The life everyone wants, he says, is really a life that doesn't require any faith. Yet the path of faith is the path of Jesus that we mark through Lent, the path of willing obedience, the path that leads to the cross. That's a path that demands a lot of us, more than we think we can bear, and there is only one way to walk it safely: get behind Jesus. Jesus has harsh words for Peter in this story. I mean, for crying out loud, Jesus calls him Satan. In Hebrew, by the way, Satan means adversary. And Peter certainly played an adversarial role when he tried to pull Jesus off the path. Get behind me is a repudiation, obviously, but this is a topsy-turvy story in which grandeur and triumph are human and suffering is divine. A story in which one loses his life by trying to save it and saves his life by being willing to lose it. In a story like this, the truth is going to be the opposite of the obvious. Right after reprimanding Peter, Jesus tells the crowd how to be a follower, or as the Greek says, one who comes behind him. Get behind me. Repudiation or invitation? Jesus scolds Peter, but he doesn't leave him stranded by the side of the road. He puts Peter safely behind him and continues the journey. Jesus knows that Peter's eagerness, Peter's mistakes, and even Peter's rebuke all come from Peter's love. And it's clear that Peter's love for Jesus gives him insight and understanding beyond that of the common crowd. Who do the people say Jesus is? Maybe John the Baptist, maybe Elijah, maybe a prophet. Who do the disciples say he is? Cries Peter immediately, "You are the Messiah." Commentator Fame Perkins notes that Peter's confession distinguishes what the disciples know about Jesus from the common views about him. Those who love Jesus most know him best. Yet that knowledge does not stop them from occasionally trying to control his message. That's what Peter's apparently doing when he takes Jesus aside. Standing in the path with Bartholomew and the rest, we can't hear what Peter's saying, but we can be pretty sure he doesn't like this talk of suffering and rejection and death. Maybe he's saying, "Jesus, that'll never preach. If we want to get the crowd's support, if we want to grow our numbers, we need a positive message. We need to preach how faith will give us a life that doesn't require any faith. Come on, Jesus, let us show you the path to success." Standing there on the road, watching Peter wave his arms, we are horrified. How does Peter dare? And we're also a little thrilled. Look, maybe we disciples can sometimes take charge. We would call this collaborative leadership, a sharing of knowledge, sound advice for Jesus. Mark's gospel would call it a rebuke of Jesus. Jesus' response is quick and stern, but it also calls to mind Proverbs 27:5. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Jesus knows that Peter's rebuke comes from Peter's love, and he puts Peter in his place, not outside his protection, but safely behind him. And then he encourages Peter and everyone else not to hide their love for him. Don't be ashamed of Jesus and his words, lest you make him ashamed of you. Don't be ashamed of loving Jesus, even if that love leads you to lowly places that others might scorn. Question Jesus if you need to. Argue with him right out in the open, but don't be ashamed of loving him. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. It's easy to identify with Peter because in our walk we're so much like him. Out of our love for Jesus comes our eagerness and sometimes our mistakes, and perhaps sometimes even a desire to rebuke Jesus, take him aside and explain why his plan won't work. Fortunately for us, daring to rebuke our master will not leave us stranded by the roadside. Jesus would rather we rebuke him openly than love him secretly. He has patience with our questions and our doubts and our moments of delusion when we seek to control his message. And fortunately for the persistence of that message, Jesus always reasserts control of the stage, gently guiding minds back to divine things and putting all the bodies back where they need to be. Ours behind his on the way to the cross. The cross is hard to talk about. Maybe that's why Jesus brought it up on the road, not face to face with the disciples, but all eyes ahead. And he will bring it up again and yet again, each time on the road. Every time he starts the conversation, he and those he loves are looking in the same direction, which ultimately is toward Jerusalem. When we are engaged in a hard conversation with Jesus, we won't always like what he says. And we may be inspired to take Jesus aside and confront him face to face. We who love Jesus most want everyone else to love him too. And we might even try to control his message if we think it will help. But depend on this: Jesus is in control. If he says, "Get behind me," it is in our best interest to do it, because that puts us back in a place where we're looking in the same direction he is, eyes ahead, toward the cross, and also toward resurrection. Amen.